Resident Evil 7 Biohazard is one of my favorite games in the franchise to date. As I mentioned in my rankings video, I absolutely love what this did for the franchise, and I'm very much happy that it was successful all the way back in 2017. Now it's 2025, so 8 years later, how does it hold up? And with Resident Evil Village now in existence and Resident Evil Requiem coming out in just a few months, how is it going to stack up against its future sequels, and is it still worth buying and playing in 2025? And the answer is yes, so I'm not sure why I asked that question. To be honest, I hope most of you answered yes as well, so that this video makes a ton of sense. So that all being said, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard holds up extremely well 8 years later, with maybe a few minor things here that are kind of nagging at it, that prevents it from being the best of the trilogy, assuming Requiem comes out and is a complete success, which it looks to be. This video could age well, or it could age poorly, so if it does age poorly, you can come back here and laugh at me for being the dumbass that I was. But we do enough of that already, so let's just talk about the man of the hour, the game of the hour, Resident Evil 7. So this game is really special, not just because of the fact that it basically revived the franchise, but also that it's a really new start to Resident Evil. It was the first time we got a new perspective in the game. This is the first time we had a first-person perspective, and I think it really works. Even still with the option to go third-person in future games, I think going all first-person really helps the immersion. I don't think there's ever been a Resident Evil game besides maybe Resident Evil 2 Remake where I felt this immersed in the actual game world that we're in. The biggest reason, of course, being that it's first person, so naturally, at least to me, I think it's just more immersive naturally, but there's also just a ton of attention to detail as well. This game still looks fantastic. Yes, I'm playing on the PC, but it still looks really, really good. You really have the attention to detail in areas where it's very, very dark, and also areas where it kind of brightens up a bit, but it has detail that just makes you kind of grotesque, a little gross here and there. As I also mentioned in another Resident Evil video, a really good thing that this game does is gross you out. At least to me, I can't stand bugs. So playing this game, it really, really disgusted me playing through a lot of the middle to second half of the game. And that's a really good thing. That's what I think the games that are going back to their horror roots should be doing. It really gives me shivers when I'm playing through that part, just because it really creeps me out, and the audio, and just, it's done just so well that I can't help but smile playing this game, and slightly crying in the background, but that's, you know, that you didn't hear that from me. I didn't say that. The game is just really special in a lot of ways, and I think they really put in a ton of passion into making it something that could hit everyone in many ways. So if you're afraid of the dark, if you're afraid of those old style kind of horror films, Evil Dead, it's basically something like that. It really appeals to that kind of horror. And while body horror doesn't really scare me as much, the audio and visuals do well of a hell of a job to really carry that part of horror in the game for me. Now, this is probably going to be the scariest of the three games, I would think, also because of the action, as this game doesn't have as much of it as you would think, so it does really play well into that horror, but at times it can feel a little dragging once you've already played the game a couple of times, once you're trying to speedrun it. When you're really trying to get through pages of the game, it can definitely feel like it's dragging, and you could nag a point or two off for that for sure, especially certain segments towards the latter half of the game where you feel like the game could have ended about maybe 20 minutes, maybe a half hour earlier. So there are definitely parts where it doesn't hold up as well compared to its brothers, Resident Evil 8 in particular, where it really ramps up the action, but it still kind of has that horror vibe in many areas. It really nails the aesthetic. So I think in that regard, it definitely does excuse some of the horror for that more action, more faster paced. Here, you don't really get that, so it can definitely feel, to some people, a little boring. I don't think boring is the right word, but just a little dragging at times towards the second half of the game, and that could definitely be felt. But I think that there's enough here for an immersive experience that Resident Evil 7, even despite not being too action-paced or not having many characters, as a matter of fact, I believe there's maybe 6 characters in total, if you're including all the characters that you actually meet in the main game, not including DLC. There's not even that many characters in the actual game you get to talk to or meet with, so it's a very lonesome game. It can definitely feel like a one-shot game, which is both good and bad. It's good in that it can basically do this whole Evil Dead thing. It can basically do the first-person perspective. It can do a lot of what it's trying to experiment with without harming the franchise too much as a whole, as we saw other games that tried to do that and were complete disasters. But on the other hand, it can also definitely feel like it's not really Resident Evil. I have seen some complaints. That's a common thing that I kind of saw, was that it didn't feel like Resident Evil, which I actually disagree with. I think Resident Evil definitely has that survival horror back to its roots, and Resident Evil 2 Remake proves this by being one of the scariest games in the franchise, while still having item management, survival horror, all that stuff. I think they're still part of the same franchise in that sense. I don't think it disconnects too far. Now, there are segments where you could argue that it does disconnect a little bit. I definitely think the DLC for sure feels like a huge disconnect from the main game itself. So if you want to argue that, it's definitely more of the DLC that does this. I think the main game itself, the idea with the mold, Evelyn, all that stuff, I think it does a really good addition to the franchise. So I don't think that's at all a problem. And since we're talking about that for a moment, I want to touch on the story a little bit, because I've already made a couple videos defending Ethan as a character. Here, as his debut game, it's definitely not the strongest debut. I will say that. It's not a strong debut, but I don't think it's a terrible one either. I definitely don't see what the issue is with having a normal, average, everyday Joe be your character, because it can work, and we saw him develop, not just through the actual game, but in Resident Evil Village as well. Now, it should never be expected for a character to have a great development outside of his own game, right? Like, it shouldn't be expected for Village to carry his entire character. He should also have gotten some development in Biohazard, and he does a little bit, not as much as you would think. And maybe he didn't win over everybody, but he won over me, okay? I think he does enough on his own that he won me over as a character, and I really like him. Some of the lines are corny or cheesy, and yeah, some of his reactions are off, but if you actually know the lore, then you know the reason why. And you also know that they're trying to go for more of a place yourself in his shoes kind of character, so that's a lot of why you'll see him react in certain ways, or why the first person is very close so that it seems like you're playing as Ethan, or you are Ethan, is the angle they're trying to go for. So you can see a lot of that there, and I definitely think that's something people should really open their minds to. It's fine if you don't like him as a character, that's perfectly fine. Not everybody has to like him, he definitely has flaws. That's 100% fine. I just think it's a little unfair to disqualify him, and the story for that matter, just because it's a little bit different, or because it's aiming for a different sort of goal here. Now, this, again, could age a little bit poorly depending on what Requiem does with the story. And the reason I keep bringing that up is because we're going to probably see a familiar character return. If you haven't heard, which I might have spoiled. I actually don't remember if I did spoil this or not, so I'm not going to mention it here. But Requiem might be bringing somebody back, so if we do see that, then it could age this video well or poorly, depending on how that goes. We'll have to wait and see. Like I said, Requiem comes out in February, so we're going to wait for that game to come out, and then I'm probably going to make another video talking about the entire trilogy once that's out, so we can compare them, because I definitely think that it's something worth talking about in the Resident Evil franchise when you compare these three games that have essentially been the renaissance of Resident Evil in the modern day. And I mean mainline titles, okay? Not the remakes, of course. As mainline titles, this is the first new trilogy that we've gotten in ages, so this is something that we're going to have to talk about sooner rather than later, so that we can actually get a good comparison talking about these characters and the new story that's being told, and how the story is going to end. Because, as we know, the Winter storyline ended in Resident Evil 8, but we could see some of those elements return in Requiem. We'll have to see for sure. But I do not believe that it harms the game in any way just because it turned out like this and how they're telling the story. So overall, I think the story is really good. I think that it's told just fine. I don't think the pacing has many problems unless you're talking about towards the end. It's definitely more of a latter half of the game where it gets a little bit worse, a little bit janky. It manages to pick itself back up, and of course it makes it up with more side content with the DLC, which is free for the extra story, and Resident Evil Village essentially improving on all of its strengths and less on its weaknesses, of course. So I would say that Biohazard as a whole has aged really well. There's not much of it that's screaming that's terrible or bad in any way. Not like in games like, let's look at Resident Evil 3 Remake, where you can clearly tell how short that game is. It just hasn't aged well in terms of how much content or how much there is to play overall. And I hate to keep picking on that game because I actually do have a lot of fun playing it, but it's just the most obvious to pick in the modern day because all of the modern day Resident Evil games, for the most part, have been absolutely fantastic. So we kind of just have to pick one to throw critiques at, and that's unfortunately the one we have to pick. Either way, though, I would say Biohazard is absolutely worth it 8 years later, and if you haven't played it yet or tried it out in VR yet, I would highly recommend it. It adds so much value to an absolute great game. But that's all I have to say for this video. If you enjoyed, please hit that like button and subscribe. I could always use a new addition to the Dark Ops army. And if you enjoyed Resident Evil 7 or any of its following sequels, please let me know in the comments below. Let me know if you like Ethan Winters as a character or his entire storyline. Let me know what your favorite part and least favorite part was of the trilogy, and what you thought Biohazard did really well, and what you thought its worst parts were, because I've got a good feeling I think we all know what the worst sections of the game are, but I'm curious. I want to see what people think, which parts are better and which parts are worse, so let me know in the comments below. But thank you guys so much for watching. This is Dark Ops. I'll see you guys in the next one.